When the sun glides across the horizon, casting a soft golden light on the mountain peaks, it seems as if this world pauses in anticipation. The wind lazily rustles through the tall grass, making it ripple like ocean waves, carrying with it the scents of dry earth, pine needles, and something warm, almost homely. Here in this remote valley, life flows slowly, as if time itself has grown weary of rushing. The farm stood at the edge of this tranquility, nestled in greenery. Its old but sturdy structure seemed to breathe with nature. Over the years, the wood had absorbed the scorching summer days, torrential rains and frosty nights, becoming an integral part of this place. Endless meadows stretched around it, bordered by massive trees whose branches bent toward the ground, creating a sense of seclusion and protection. It seemed that there was no place here for worries, noise, and the bustle of the outside world. I lived here alone, but my solitude was never empty. It was conscious, desired. Here every morning began with the first rays of the sun, when the rooster's crow filled the air, and the breeze was fresh and cool, as if woven from dew. Every morning I stepped onto the porch, taking a deep breath, feeling the lightness of the new day fill me. The farm didn't demand much, only my hands, my labor, and my attention, and I gave it all with pleasure. My animals were my family. Cows leisurely chewed their cud, horses moved steadily in their pens, and chickens scurried around the yard, begging for treats. I knew their habits, their preferences, knew which cow liked to scratch against the old fence, and which horse startled at loud noises. They couldn't speak, but I understood them. In a world full of human voices, often deceitful and empty, I found meaning in silence, in gestures and glances. But among all the inhabitants of the farm, there was one who didn't fit into its rhythm. The horse stood in the far corner of the pen, as if separating itself from everything alive around it. Its golden coat, marred by the traces of time and wounds, glinted in the last rays of the sun, but did not shine like that of the other horses. It didn't move, didn't react to sounds, didn't lift its head when I passed by. It existed, but as if it weren't there. I named him Echo. He had appeared on the farm a month ago, brought to me by a man I had known for only a couple of years. He shrugged and said briefly, "I don't need him anymore. Do whatever you want with him." At that moment, I looked into the horse's eyes and saw emptiness there. Not fear, not anger, not pain, just emptiness, deep as an abyss. Echo was broken. I saw it immediately. People say that animals don't feel what we do. They live by instinct, get used to owners, conditions, warmth and cold. But they are wrong. Sometimes an animal's eyes can tell more than any words. I had seen many horses in my life, seen nervous, wild, stubborn, affectionate ones, but I had never met one like him. I didn't know what they had done to him, but I knew his spirit was lost somewhere far away, in a past that, like iron chains, held him until now. Neighbors said it was pointless. "He's already lost, Ed. Don't waste your time." But I didn't listen to them, not because I was stubborn, but because deep down, I couldn't accept that fate could be final. Every evening I approached the pen, sat down nearby, and just waited. I didn't try to talk, didn't reach out, didn't do anything that might scare him. I just stayed present. At first, Echo didn't even notice me. He looked into the distance, into the void. But over time, I began to notice tiny changes. His ears twitched, barely perceptibly catching sounds. He no longer turned away so sharply. But most importantly, his breathing became a little slower when I was near. It was an insignificant, almost invisible change. But to me, it meant everything. I didn't know how long it would take. I didn't know if I would ever see anything other than emptiness in his eyes. But I knew one thing: I would wait. Night fell over the valley, enveloping the farm in a soft darkness. Only one lamp was lit in the house, its warm light flickering in the windows like a living flame. Outside the window, in the pens, the animals had already settled down for the night. Even the rooster, who usually felt it his duty to crow at any time of day, was silent. But one of the farm's inhabitants was not asleep. I stood by the window and looked at the dark figure in the pen. Echo. He wasn't lying down, wasn't resting, didn't show even a hint of fatigue. He just stood there, head bowed, as if he had forgotten what it meant to feel safe. I knew that such behavior was not just a habit, it was memory. I didn't know exactly what had happened to him. The neighbor who brought him here didn't share details and I didn't ask, but the truth was written on his body. The first time I examined him, my fingers lingered on the old scars crisscrossing his back and sides. They weren't fresh, but they were deep, and their origin was undeniable. They were marks of cruelty, marks that remain not only on the skin but also within. I had seen how horses learn to fear people. They remember pain, remember shouts, blows, remember being denied food, water, shelter. They remember how loneliness becomes their only companion. I didn't need to know the details to understand that Echo was one of those horses. I went outside, letting the night air envelop me with its coolness. The grass underfoot was soft and damp with dew, and the moonlight outlined the contours of trees, fences, everything that surrounded the farm. I slowly made my way to the pen. He heard me. I knew this because, although he didn't lift his head, his breathing became a little faster, a little tenser. I didn't approach too close. I just stopped by the wooden fence and leaned against it, as I had done many evenings before. "I don't know what happened to you," I said softly, "but you are alive." My words dissolved into the night air, evoking no reaction. I sighed. "You are alive and you are here. That's all that matters right now." Echo didn't move. I didn't expect him to suddenly lift his head, approach me, trust me. I knew that wouldn't happen. Trust isn't born from words. It comes with time. I didn't know how long it would take. Maybe weeks, maybe months, or maybe he would never change. But I couldn't just give up. I lowered myself to the ground, crossing my arms over my chest and stared at the sky. Here, far from the city lights, the stars shone so brightly that it seemed you could reach out and touch them. I remembered how, as a child, I loved looking at them, imagining that each one was someone's forgotten world, full of stories that no one remembered anymore. Stories like Echo's. I didn't know his past, but I knew it haunted him like a ghost. And I knew one thing. If given the chance, he would remain in that shadow forever. I looked at the horse. "Tomorrow we start from the beginning," I said, not expecting a response. He didn't move. But as I stood up to leave, it seemed, just for a second, that his ears twitched in my direction. It was almost imperceptible, but to me, it meant everything. Morning came, as always, peacefully. The sun slowly rose from behind the hills, spreading across the sky in soft orange-pink hues. The farm was waking up. Chickens bustled in the yard. Cows stretched lazily, enjoying the first rays of light. Even the wind, as if awakened by this morning, slowly rustled the leaves on the trees. I stood by the pen, watching Echo. He was awake too, but unlike the other animals, he didn't look relaxed. He wasn't eating, drinking, or showing any desire to leave his inner world. I took a bucket of fresh oats with me. Slowly, without sudden movements, I entered the pen. The horse lifted his head. It was the first time he had looked at me so intently. I stopped, giving him time. "It's just food, buddy," I said softly, placing the bucket on the ground. He didn't move. I took another step forward. Echo tensed, barely perceptibly, but I had already learned to notice every little thing in his behavior. I stopped. "I won't touch you." I sat down right in the grass, crossing my legs. Minutes passed. The wind played with my shirt, the sun rose higher. I didn't move. More minutes passed. Nothing. But I waited. I knew that the most important thing now was time. Time and silence. The world is used to rushing, always demanding immediate results. But with someone like Echo, it works differently. Silence is a language understood only by those who have learned to listen. It took about half an hour before Echo took his first step forward. I barely breathed. He came closer, just a few centimeters. Stopped. His nostrils quivered, his ears twitched, as if he was arguing with himself. But he didn't step back. That was already a victory. I didn't try to approach, didn't try to take advantage of this moment. I just continued to sit, allowing him to decide what to do next. He took another step. His nose was now just half a meter from the bucket of oats. I saw the struggle in his eyes. Hunger versus fear. He knew he could just come and eat, but something inside him stopped him. How many times had he taken this step before, only to feel pain? How long had he lived in a world where any movement could result in a blow? I couldn't give him an answer. I could only wait, and he waited with me. So we sat. He looked at me, and I looked at him. The wind rustled the trees, birds chirped overhead. Life around us continued. But inside this small pen, a different battle was taking place. I didn't know how much time had passed before Echo took another step forward, but I knew it was an important step. He reached for the bucket, cautiously inhaled the scent of oats, but didn't eat. I held my breath. He looked at me again, and I saw something new in his eyes. It wasn't trust, but it was a beginning. I didn't say a word, but something inside me stirred. Maybe for the first time in a long time, Echo wondered if the world could be different from what he knew. And that meant everything. Days followed one after another, and with each new morning, I watched Echo, looking for even the slightest changes in him. At first, they were almost imperceptible, barely noticeable gestures, movements that could have been taken for coincidence. But I knew, there are no coincidences. Every time I brought food, he tensed a little less. His breathing became steadier, his muscles less tight. I didn't try to rush the process. Patience is the only key to a broken being. It seemed to me that he still didn't believe that in this world there could be things that didn't cause pain. One morning, when the sun had just begun to spread its warm rays over the grass, I brought Echo a bucket of oats again. But this time, I didn't place it far away. I placed it right in front of me. The task was simple. If he wanted to eat, he had to come closer to me than ever before. I saw his hesitation. Hunger fought with fear. 1 minute, 2, 5, and then he took a step forward, and another, slowly, cautiously, as if every muscle in his body resisted this movement. I froze. Echo came so close that I could hear his breathing. He stretched out his head, inhaled the scent of oats, and froze. A second of silence. His nostrils quivered. And then, very carefully, he lowered his head and began to eat. I didn't move. It seemed to me that any movement would destroy this fragile moment. I just sat there, feeling my heart pounding in my chest. This was more than just food. This was a choice. He chose not to run away. He chose to trust. Even if only for a few minutes, it was the first brick in the ruined wall he had built around himself. The next day, I decided to try something else. I entered the pen not with a bucket of food, but with myself. Echo looked at me warily, but no longer with the desperate fear of before. I slowly extended my hand, not to touch, just to leave it in the air, to give him the chance to decide for himself what he wanted. For a minute, he stood still, and then he took a step. His nose was just a few centimeters from my palm. He froze. I saw him struggling with himself. His ears twitched. His gaze flicked between me and the empty space in front of him. And then, unexpectedly, he touched my hand with his warm breath. I don't know if he realized the significance of that moment himself, but I knew one thing. It was the first time he had taken a step towards me on his own. Later, I sat on the porch of the house, watching the sun set over the horizon. I thought about how trust doesn't have a clear moment of birth. There is no single victory that decides everything. There are only small steps. Every day is a choice. Today, Echo chose me. But tomorrow, I didn't know. But I knew one thing. I would be here and wait, no matter how long it took. Everything was going too well. Not that I was a pessimist, but over the years I had learned, if something starts to improve, expect a blow. And the blow always comes unexpectedly. That day the air was tense, thick, sultry. I felt it from the morning. Something hung in the air, something invisible but real, like the calm before a storm. Echo felt it too. His steps became sharper. His ears twitched more often, as if he was trying to catch the sound of danger. He ate, but without appetite. His gaze became distant again. I knew I couldn't lose patience, but inside I felt something restless stirring, a premonition that something bigger than just a bad day lay ahead. Later in the afternoon, I went to the barn. I needed to check the hay supplies. When I came back out, the first drops of rain hit the dusty ground. I looked at the sky. Black clouds had gathered over the mountains. A storm. I realized it was bad even before the thunder tore through the air with a deafening roar. But even I wasn't prepared for what happened next. The storm began suddenly. The wind picked up, bending the grass, and rain poured down, flooding everything with muddy streams. And amidst it all, a scream, wild, piercing, full of terror. Echo. I rushed to the pen. He was thrashing about, as if all the fear he had held inside had burst out. His eyes were wild, his nostrils flared, his body tense. He was trying to escape, but not just from the rain. I saw he wasn't there. His mind was far away, in that past from which he had fled. Every flash of lightning, every rumble of thunder, it was as if they were reminders of what he had once endured. I saw how he kicked at the ground, thrashed in panic, how everything we had achieved crumbled in seconds. I knew that if he broke completely now, there would be no way back. I couldn't let that happen. I stepped into the pen. Rain lashed at my face, my clothes were instantly soaked, but I paid no attention. "Echo!" I shouted. He didn't even look at me. I moved forward straight towards him. "Echo, it's me!" No reaction. I knew I had to do something, now or never. I did the last thing that could help. I approached him closely and placed my hand on his neck. For a moment he froze, breathing heavily, chest heaving. I felt him trembling. I didn't say anything, just kept my hand there. I didn't force him to stay still, didn't try to grab him, just let him feel that he wasn't alone. A second passed. 2, 3. Rain poured, lightning flashed, but I felt him starting to breathe slower. His eyes were still full of terror, but he was coming back. He stood before me, breathing heavily, his nostrils still quivering. But he didn't run away. He chose to stay. I removed my hand. He didn't move. Somewhere in the distance, thunder still split the sky, but he was no longer thrashing. It wasn't a miracle. It was a step, tiny, fragile. But it was a step, and standing in the rain, soaked to the bone, I knew Echo had just won his most important battle. But another test awaited us. This time, for me. The storm passed as suddenly as it had come. When the last drops of rain fell to the ground and the wind died down, I stood by the pen, watching Echo. He was still breathing heavily, his coat was wet, his eyes tense, but he hadn't run away. That fact alone meant more than any words. I took a step back, giving him space. He didn't flinch. I didn't try to touch him again. That would be too much. But I knew. He had heard me. Not with words, with something deeper. Something that lives deeper than any words. The next morning, the farm breathed with its usual life. I went outside, inhaled the cool air, and, as always, headed straight to Echo's pen. And this is what I saw. He was standing right by the fence, waiting for me, not because he was hungry, not because he had nowhere else to go. He chose to come closer. I took a step towards him, and he didn't move. I raised my hand, slowly, unhurriedly, and he let me touch his muzzle. I didn't deceive myself. Echo hadn't become a different horse. He hadn't turned into a trusting, affectionate horse overnight. The fear of the past still lived within him, but now he had something else, a choice. He was no longer a prisoner of his memories. Now he had a door, an exit, a chance to choose a different path. And me? I realized that this whole story was not just about him. It was a lesson for me too, about how real changes happen slowly, about how trust doesn't come suddenly, but is built step by step, about how each of us carries something broken within, but that doesn't mean we can't be healed. The farm was still the same. The mountains still towered on the horizon. The wind still whispered in the leaves. But I knew in this world, there was now one living heart that was no longer lost. Echo had taken his first real step towards freedom, and me, I had taken mine.